name is Corey Merritt, and I work for a security solutions company named Sage ISG, or Sage Infrastructure Solutions Group. We focus on the implementation of secure solutions for customers leveraging both open source products and products from our partners, such as Fortinet, Citrix, Parallels, and others. Now, we do this as a complement to our risk advisory business and to our penetration services that we offer. So these aren't solutions that we technically advertise on our website, even though we are partners with these companies and we have implemented some very large scale solutions. Now, this video series is really meant to help you as a business owner determine what are the capabilities you need for remote access and what are the solutions that are available to give you those options while we're working through this difficult time. Over the last while, I've heard many companies and individual consultants pitch that they're available to offer their services to help set up remote worker capabilities. Now, as a security professional, this can be pretty frightening because a lot of times what they're talking about is enabling remote access without consideration for the potential risks that it's going to introduce your company to. So I wanted to put this video series together to talk to you not only about the remote access options that are available to you, but also the security implications, what types of costs you'll be looking at a high level, and the difficulty that you're going to be seeing when these different solutions are implemented by companies. Because not all solutions are equal with regards to how easy they are to implement. Now, it's with this in mind that I've decided to put together this overview. And in addition to this, I will be providing instructions to help those businesses that are less fortunate, so the smaller businesses that maybe don't have the bankroll to afford the expensive Citrix consultancies, set up those solutions for themselves. My goal is to make sure that business owners, including small business owners, are aware of the options that are available to them and supply them with instructions, where possible, that help them implement remote worker solutions in a secure manner. All right, so before we get rolling here, let's talk a little bit about the agenda for this presentation. We're going to review the capabilities that you require to enable your business or your users within your business to work remotely. We'll go through some of the remote options that are available. So things like copying your files to a cloud provider such as Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive. We'll look at VPN and remote desktop options. So if you are going to provide VPN access into your environment as part of your core strategy, we'll talk about the do's and don'ts of implementing a VPN. We'll look at something called Citrix Virtual Apps and virtual desktops. Now, this is something I've implemented on a very large scale, tens of thousands of users. So if you're a larger organization and you haven't already looked at Citrix and you do have the bankroll, and that's the key here, Citrix might be an option and you definitely should look at this. Parallels Remote Access. Parallels has been a partner of ours for quite a few years now, and they offer remote access solutions as well that are similar to Citrix, but much less costly. Now, they don't have all the same capabilities, so we'll go through that in a few minutes. Microsoft Remote Access. So this isn't remote desktop. This is the remote desktop services that are built into the Windows Server operating system and that will allow you to access systems within your environment, while more specifically applications hosted on an app server within your environment using a web interface. Open source remote access, such as Guacamole. Now, Guacamole is something that probably very few people watching this video have heard of. It is an open source, completely free product that you can implement within your environment. We'll go through its capabilities in a few minutes. And we'll also talk a little bit about other paid solutions, things like GoToMyPC or TeamViewer, which you might be actually tempted to use for administration or to remotely access your desktops. And I'm probably going to strongly advise against it, but we'll get to that in due time. So with any solution, I always recommend that customers start by looking at the capabilities they require first. It's too often that I see customers go out there and they buy a product because it has shiny lights on it, or the salesperson is extremely good at their job, and there's a lot of good salespeople out there. And what they'll do is they'll oftentimes convince customers that they need all these bells and whistles to buy the creme de la creme product, when really the capabilities the customer needs are much simpler than that. So when you're looking at capabilities for remote access, think about what you need to access. Do you have files on servers that are located at your office? If you do, then maybe you need a remote file sharing solution. We'll talk about Nextcloud and some options for that in a few minutes. Do you need to access computers, physical PCs that are sitting at your offices, or servers? Well, those could require either one solution or multiple solutions. And lastly, do you need to access your infrastructure components? Do you need to be able to manage switches remotely, access Mac OS X desktops or other Linux desktops within your environment? If you do, then that can also govern or change the remote access solution that you're looking at. Is there potential for corporate or client confidential data to be exposed? Now, this is something that everybody should consider. We all have customer information that includes not only the names of our customers, but also their addresses, potentially their phone numbers. This is information that customers aren't going to appreciate getting out, and there's actually laws against it. So the last thing you want to do is enable remote access and have your customer data or corporate data exposed. If you're pursuing ISO 20001, then you need to really consider what you do for remote access, because within ISO 27001, you need to make sure that you maintain that need to know principle and that users are only provided access with data based on their job roles and their need to know. So let's kick this first option around right away. You may be tempted to copy the files that are on your corporate servers or on desktops within your environment up to the cloud and copy them to your Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive and then use that to share with your colleagues. Now, not that those are bad options. If it's done right, you can enable security for these solutions, but be very careful, because even though it's easy to set up, if we look at our pros here, and you can copy in all your corporate files to these solutions, keep in mind that it's also very easy to access and share that information. And without proper training, your users could inadvertently share info that you don't want to get out there. Either corporate financials, could be, customer information or customer contact lists. Well, we don't want to have that because it puts your business at unnecessary risk. So remote access can't be just enabled by simply copying files up to OneDrive or up to your Google Drive, because doing that exposes you to other risks that it really, quite frankly, isn't worth it. So the cons here, well, without proper planning and training, it's possible users could share confidential data. And let's take a look at that. When we go into Google Drive, for example, we see the option when we right-click on a file to share or get a shareable link. Now, if we share, we can share with specific email addresses. But first, let's talk about what happens when we share with a link. Now, notice this one note that Google's giving us when we share with a link. And in the Microsoft world, when we're talking about OneDrive, if we share with a link, this is very similar. In the Microsoft world, when you share with a link, you are going to get the ability to share with view-only access or edit access. In the case of Google Drive, when we share a link, anyone that has access to that link can view. Now, they may not be able to change things, but they will be able to view. And as we see here, this link is something that you could just copy and paste into an email, send off to your users, and they could in turn send that to other companies and so on and so forth. So your information could be available to other people very quickly if somebody makes a mistake when typing an email address to send out this link to someone, or maybe inadvertently includes this in the email trail as they're forwarding the email along. Now, the other option here is to share with a specific user. Now, all of these solutions that are available have limitations. So for example, if you're in Google, Google allows you to share with other Google users or with Facebook users and give them different permission levels. However, if you're trying to share with somebody who uses a corporate email account, for example, at Sage ISG, well, that user probably won't have or may not have a Google account or a Facebook account. I know that sounds funny. I don't have a Facebook account. I do have a Google account. So you would think somebody would have one or the other. Now, the bigger threat here is that in order to share, my Google account is actually my personal account. So if somebody wanted to share files with me using Google Drive, chances are they would share it with my personal email account, because I don't have a corporate Google account. And as a result of that, my personal account would then have access to any of those files that are shared. So anybody who compromises my personal user account in that scenario would have access to the corporate files that have been shared with me. Not really desirable. Now, if we send a link, then again, it shares with only those people. But if we send an invitation and we have the link copied again, we'll get the same option as above, where we've actually copied or sent that link and forwarded it and just used a different mechanism to get it there. So from a capabilities to mitigate security perspective, when we're talking about Google Drive and Microsoft OneDrive, now OneDrive is a little bit different, because if you do have the time to properly define your data classification, OneDrive does have the ability to integrate with Microsoft's DLP offerings, in which case you could potentially, through their data loss prevention, put in rules to restrict what data can be shared and moved around within your environment or outside of your environment. Now, if you don't have that, though, using Google Drive as an example, I strongly recommend against just simply copying corporate files up to a cloud sharing provider and enabling remote access in that fashion. So let's talk about our next option. What about a VPN? Well, this is something that's available on most routers. It's easy to set up. So this is including home-based routers. They usually include something called OpenVPN. It's built into Cisco routers, Fortinet routers, Palo Alto. It doesn't really matter what solution you're going with. You will have VPN capabilities. Now, what differs here, though, is what you can do with the VPN to restrict user activity. A lot of times when companies implement a VPN solution, they implement that VPN solution and it's as simple as just right-clicking and connecting or going to a website and clicking connect. And then, for all intents and purposes, the user's computer is almost the same as sitting on the corporate network, or it is sitting on the corporate network. So as soon as that VPN connection is established, all of the file servers, web servers, and so on that are within the corporate environment become accessible to that end user. Now, this is good, right? Because now you've enabled remote access, you don't have any potential threats, or do you? Well, what if this home user has a virus? What systems could potentially be impacted by that virus? If they truly are just sitting on your corporate network without any kind of restricted access to those file servers, web servers, and so on, then any viruses that they have at home could potentially propagate into your data center or into your corporate network. So for that reason, if you are going to enable VPN access, make sure that you enable VPN access and have security mechanisms such as access control lists that define which servers as well as applications that users can access once they're connected with that VPN. Now, a lot of companies don't do this. In fact, a lot of large organizations that I've worked with simply allow users to VPN right into their network, and once they're in, they have access to everything that they would when they were sitting at work, which is great from a convenience factor, but from a security professional perspective, that truly scares me. Do not just enable a VPN connection into your environment or allow a consultant to enable a VPN connection into your environment without considering what you could be exposing over that connection. So make sure that you put in the proper restrictions, firewall rules, as well as data protection restrictions, maybe even isolate data, in order to ensure that you don't expose any personally identifiable information or confidential data that you don't want exposed via this VPN. So home users in general, consider them insecure. If you're sitting at home, I highly doubt you're taking the same precautions as you do at work. It'd be great if you did, but you probably don't. So if you are going to enable VPN access to your users, look at permitting VPN access only for specific purposes. So for example, if an HR person needs to connect in and connect to the Sage accounting system, or they need to someone needs to connect in and modify the HR database in some way, then only give them access to that HR database or only give them access to the accounting system. Don't, for the HR person, don't give them access to all your file servers, web servers, and everything else. And that's the idea of an access control list. Make sure that your VPN users have access only to what they need to access in order to perform their duties. Now, any professional that comes in to set up a VM or VPN solution for you will likely have an idea of what they're supposed to do, but without understanding your actual applications that you're using in your environment, they may not implement the security correctly. And that's where getting somebody who's got experience with this is definitely something that you want to do. Don't just pick any old consultant off the street to enable remote access to your environment, or you may find that you may be giving a lot more access than you planned on. Now, one of the most, I'd say the simplest solutions for users to use, not necessarily for you to set up, but the simplest solutions for users is a Citrix solution. Citrix has been around for a long time. I personally have been working with it since MetaFrame 1.2, I believe. I'm dating myself a bit here. And you will find that out of all the solutions that are out there, if you're allowing access to a Windows environment, Citrix provides not only some of the best performance, but also some of the best security for providing that remote access that I've worked with anyway. Now, some of the pros here, you will have access to your web applications, virtual desktops, as well as physical desktops. So you can install a Citrix agent on your user's desktop, and then from home, they can use the Citrix portal to access their desktop. Or you can have virtual desktops that they access. And lastly, you could have a application server, just a standard Windows server, running your applications, and users could be provided access to either those applications individually, or they could be provided with access to the desktop of the server. Now, Citrix has some of the best performance, as I mentioned. I've watched streaming video, I've done conference calls on properly set up Citrix solutions. This is really the creme de la creme. It's scalable to almost any size, as long as you have enough funding and infrastructure available. So don't underestimate how much it's going to cost and what you need to have on hand for servers as well as storage, especially, and networking. It's the best option available to you, though, if it's set up right and you have that budget to optimize the infrastructure. Now, some of the cons here with the Citrix solution, it can range from simple to set up with the Citrix Workspace Suite to very difficult, depending on what you want to provide access to. For example, providing access to web applications can involve consultancy from Citrix themselves to set up your cloud access gateway properly. Now, many components actually have to be set up for a Citrix solution to function properly. You need to have a license server in your environment. You need to have a broker to broker your connections to your physical and virtual desktops. You probably need to have at least one or more application servers in your environment if you're going to do server-based hosting of applications. And you need to deploy the agent to the physical desktops within your environment. So there is work to be done to get a Citrix solution working correctly. As a result of that, this is a con in this case, because not only are we in a bit of a crunch here if you haven't already got the solution in place, but the infrastructure and the costs associated with setting up that infrastructure may be something that's out of reach at this time. Now, as I mentioned, it's the best performance at the most significant cost in comparison with the other remote access solutions. Now, in most Citrix solutions, a VPN isn't necessary. In fact, I have never set up a Citrix solution myself where I've used a VPN. There's always been something called the Secure Access Gateway or the Citrix NetScaler, which is implemented in front of the Citrix solutions. And by implementing their full suite of products, you will get a very secure way to provide access to your environment for your end users. Now, there are a lot of costs. You need to have, for two-factor authentication, the best solution is to go with an RSA or a dual solution. Again, some of these may not be in the scope of this conversation because we're just trying to get you introduced to what you need from a capabilities perspective. But do know that if you go the Citrix road, you're talking about probably anywhere from at least 2 weeks to a month minimum for a small environment to get everything properly architected and set up. In larger environments, this can take a lot longer. So Citrix is definitely a contender. It's one of the best options you have out there for remote access or providing remote access to your users, especially to Windows environments. If you have Linux, Mac OS X, or you don't have the budget to purchase the hardware or the Citrix licensing, then this may not be an option for you. Okay, so Parallels Remote Access. Now, Parallels Remote Access is another solution. It's a remote access server, so it's a dedicated server that you would use to install your applications. There's an installation of a Parallels broker component that goes on it. And from there, you can broker access securely to your business applications as well as existing desktops. And those existing desktops might be Microsoft desktops, or they could be desktops like Mac OS X or Linux running VNC. There's no SSH access, but you do have full VNC and RDP access through this. Now, it's scalable. It can be used by most small and medium businesses. I personally try to cap this one at around 500 users. I wouldn't go too much higher than that because it can be a lot of load on the servers in that case. And I would probably lean more towards a Citrix solution if you're trying to get above 500 users. From a cons perspective, it is using native RDP as well as VNC connections to access the different systems that you're providing access to or the applications. In the Citrix solution, they're using something called the ICA protocol, so it's very streamlined. It offers a significant performance increase over the standard RDP connection. But this is much easier to set up. It doesn't have the overhead. We don't have to set up as many components to get a functional environment. So while there is some server infrastructure, like a broker to be set up, it's not nearly the complexity we would have in architecting a Citrix environment properly. And it does offer decent performance. Not great performance, but decent performance, just like a remote desktop connection does. Now, the parallel solution can be integrated into two-factor authentication, so you'll get that two-factor where users can use their password that they normally use, along with either an SMS code sent to their phone or the integration with an RSA server, so very similar to Citrix in that respect. With Parallel's remote access server, you're probably going to find that from an implementation perspective, this can probably be installed within a day, and you can be up and running for some of your services within that same day. So from a difficulty perspective, this is much easier than Citrix, as I mentioned. Now, from a costing perspective, for the Parallel solution, you do need to pay for a Microsoft Terminal Services license for each of the users that are connecting. So that's going to be somewhere around 100 to 120 users, or $120 a user, depending on what type of license or what your license agreement with Microsoft is. Then you'll also have to pay somewhere around $100 a user for the remote access licenses themselves. And I'm ballparking this, again, the very loose numbers. So we're coming to around $200 a user. Now, I didn't really talk to you about the pricing of the Citrix solution, but Citrix, it ranges in price and there's a pretty big gap. For the most expensive Citrix component, it's going to be somewhere around $600 to $700 a user to get all of the bells and whistles that you would need to optimize and enable the best experience. The cheapest Citrix solution that you're going to probably get will be somewhere around $200 a user as well. That's probably just brokering desktop access to physical desktops. So no virtual desktops, no complicated infrastructure, just allowing the users to access the desktops that they have sitting on your site right now in a secure fashion. You're going to be somewhere around $200, $250 a user or desktop that you allow access to. Now, Microsoft also includes a remote access solution built into their server operating system, and it's the Microsoft Remote Desktop Services. And what this does is it allows you to implement, it's almost like Citrix was, 5 or 10 years ago, where you have a secure access gateway, which is a web interface that you go to in order to access your applications. Once you click on that application, it goes to a Microsoft Terminal server. The application is then rendered to you via a screen scrape. So in other words, you're not directly accessing your corporate network at any given time, just like a Citrix solution or a Parallel solution. Instead, what you're doing is you're seeing the screen of the machine on your premises at your office, and you're able to interact with it, click on things, run applications, and the performance is actually quite decent. It's the same as Microsoft Remote Desktop. It's just you're using a secure web interface to access it. So you can securely access your key business applications that run on a dedicated server. It's scalable and is great for small to medium businesses. If you have a Microsoft server solution in place already, this is probably one of your quickest avenues to getting a remote access solution set up. So as I mentioned, it's very similar to Citrix of old. Some of the infrastructure, the server infrastructure, will be required. You'll have to have a terminal server. You will need terminal services licenses, which remember are around $100 to $120 a user. It will offer the same performance as a remote desktop connection. It's actually using remote desktop. So all it's doing is it's a web interface. When you click on the links within the web interface, it launches the remote desktop client, and you're able then to access those desktops through that remote access server. Now, the Microsoft solution is available, as I mentioned, with multi-factor authentication. So you can log in with your corporate username and password and also use a second factor, which could be an SMS message to your cell phone. Now, at this time, a lot of the small businesses that are out there won't even have the $100 or $200 a user to get any of the solutions we've talked about so far set up. Instead, for those users who are running a small business, even micro business, and you want to provide remote access to your users, a better solution may even be to go with an open source solution. And there's not very many available. In fact, the only one that I'll really mention that's, in my opinion, enterprise ready, where you can actually integrate it with your Active Directory for authentication and use groups to provide access to different desktops or services, is something called Guacamole. Now with Guacamole, users connect to a web interface, and in that web interface, it lists all of the applications that they have access to. And it also provides you with the ability to access other services, such as SSH-enabled services. So we could remote to our switches, the equivalent of using PuTTY, through a web interface, and it's HTML5, so you're just working within a web interface itself. And as I mentioned, you can access your switches, servers such as Linux, your Windows systems, and Mac OS X and Linux desktops via VNC. So it's a great solution for small business, or in an enterprise, an excellent solution as a jump server. And I've actually done this for several customers now. It's Active Directory integrated, as I mentioned. So if you do have applications or desktops and you want to provide access to them based on an Active Directory group, then you can add your users to a group, and only those users in those designated groups will see the applications and or desktops that you've exposed through Guacamole. Now the cons here, scalability can be challenging in large environments, which is why I'm really not mentioning that you should set this up other than as a jump server in large environments. Jump server, no brainer. I can show you great examples of how this can be used as a jump server. In small businesses though, I see this as a quick and easy way to give you the ability to provide remote access to your desktops sitting physically within your environment, or even to virtual desktops or applications. Now, the small business solution, we typically implement a single or a couple of servers. So they could be virtual servers or physical servers. On average, you're looking at, for one server with 16 gigs of RAM, 4 processors, you can access anywhere from 50 to 100 desktops within your environment. So for a small business, again, this is a great solution. The Microsoft solution, as I mentioned, is multi-factor authentication. Well, so is Guacamole. Guacamole has the ability to use two-factor authentication, just like the Microsoft solution, the Citrix solution, or the Parallels solution did. Now, this last set of solutions I'm going to talk about, I consider less secure. From a security expert perspective, in fact, I often recommend that customers really watch out for these services being run in their environment and strongly advise against it. So a couple of the solutions that I'm talking about here are things like GoToMyPC. Now this is great for a home user. GoToMyPC on your home PC, if you want to install it there, go ahead. It registers with a cloud provider. You log in with that cloud account, and once you're logged in with the cloud account, you can access the desktop that's running GoToMyPC at your house. Now, if you think about it from a work perspective, though, if a user installs GoToMyPC or TeamViewer on your work network, what it actually does is it registers with that cloud service again, and you can log into that cloud web interface and access those desktops in your environment where GoToMyPC is installed, or TeamViewer. But it's outside of the control of your corporate IT. So what ends up happening is the connection that's being made to your PC through your firewall is often not approved for corporate use or by your corporate IT team. And in fact, it creates a security hole in your corporate environment because you're not logging on now with credentials that can be monitored. You're logging on to a cloud service, and chances are your corporation has no access to those the audit logs. So when you log on through the cloud service and enable access to a desktop that way, if somebody else did manage to gain access to your cloud credentials, they would have full access to your corporate network then potentially through that connection. So I strongly recommend against this. However, some small businesses, and again, home-based businesses or home users, are probably going to choose this option for remote access. There's no real setup to be done. You just subscribe as a GoToMyPC user, install the agent on whichever PCs you want to access remotely, and then you log on to their web service and gain access to those PCs. Now, the cons here, I think, far outweigh the pros in the sense that authentication is performed, as I mentioned, by the cloud provider. It's not using your corporate directory. It's not using user accounts and passwords that are managed or monitored by your corporate IT team in most cases. So I strongly recommend against this one for use in this time of need. I would focus on getting Guacamole up and running before I would leverage these solutions to enable access to corporate desktops or servers in your environment. So security isn't applicable in these environments where this is implemented because you're actually allowing people to tunnel through your firewall without corporate IT knowledge and potentially access desktops. So these should be strictly prohibited by policy, and I strongly recommend that you avoid these solutions when looking for a remote access solution to enable your business. So the security risk from an IT department perspective is not acceptable. So definitely before you ever install this, check with your corporate IT team, and that includes TeamViewer, not just GoToMyPC. TeamViewer as well is a common one I've seen out there. Check with your IT team first before you install these tools in your corporate environment. And again, I strongly recommend against it. Okay, so let's recap what we've covered or what we've talked about. So some of the options that we discussed were, and we'll walk through these one at a time and just quickly recap. Copy the files to the cloud. Well, my advice here was don't do it without proper planning or without data loss prevention in place. Copying all corporate files to the cloud, or even corporate files that could potentially cause some risk of exposure, such as personally identifiable information or financial data, should be avoided at all costs. Users will often share links with the cloud or cloud links to other users, unaware of the fact that they're exposing your corporate data, which is accessible to anybody who has access to the link in most cases. And again, this is not a blanket statement. Just be careful. Don't just select this because it's the simplest solution to implement. Make sure you consider the security of your company and your customers before you choose this solution. Now, VPN access to the corporate network. Again, a lot of companies have this in place already. It's not, in some cases, implemented correctly. Your VPN should not terminate on your corporate network in the same location as all of your servers. If they do, then when a user is VPN'd in and has a virus, that virus could propagate into your data center and affect your servers. So think ransomware or malware here that spreads through, file services or web servers. This could make it into your environment. So if you are going to enable a VPN, the discussion here was make sure that it's planned properly and that you have the proper access control lists in place so that users can only access those resources that they require access to in order to perform their job duties. Citrix Remote App and Desktop Solutions. This is by far the creme de la creme from a performance perspective. It is by far also the most difficult to set up and the most costly solution of the ones available. So if you're a small business, or if you don't already have the infrastructure or have budget set aside for the infrastructure and licensing to implement Citrix, it likely isn't going to be the solution that you want to implement in this particular case. Parallels Remote Access Server, much simpler to set up than Citrix, not quite the same level of performance, however, very decent performance for what you get. The cost is about a third of a Citrix solution, maybe even less, depending on what you're implementing and to what extent. We can sometimes get some pretty good deals for licensing on the Parallel side. On the Microsoft Remote Desktop Services side, again, you're looking at purchasing a terminal services license, so roughly $100 to $120 a user, give or take, depending on your Microsoft license agreement. The Microsoft solution does involve some infrastructure setup, and after setting it up myself, my preference is to go with Parallels rather than just a pure Microsoft solution. But again, that's a preference. It's not something that you need to adhere to. Just if people are setting up solutions for you and you are given the option to choose between the two, do take a look at both. On the open source side, Guacamole, it's fairly easy to set up, especially on a small scale basis, up to 100 users. It does scale quite nicely between 50 and 100 users. I've set up a few solutions like this now. It's great as a jump server, absolutely amazing in an enterprise. But for small business, look at it. Well, you could look at it for a jump server in small business too. But small businesses, I'd strongly encourage you to look at Guacamole if you haven't already. On the enterprise side, if you haven't looked at Guacamole, look at it. It's great for a jump server. And finally, the other solutions we talked about, which are less secure, such as GoToMyPC or the TeamViewer application. Be careful with these ones. It may seem like they're the path of least resistance and that they're the quickest way to get access to your corporate assets. But again, because of the lack of monitoring that your corporate IT team will have, or even in a small business, the lack of control that you will have as to whether or not you see somebody come in and access files they shouldn't over those connections is a little bit terrifying. So you could expose yourself to other financial or legal risks by utilizing these services without proper planning and without isolating the computers where they're running so that they can't potentially access other data that you don't want to be exposed or confidential data. So be careful when you're looking at other solutions. Again, my recommendation always, if you have money, go Citrix. If you don't have money, look Parallels. And if you're really, really strapped and you need something free, look at Guacamole. Those are my choices if I was in most situations today. Our company itself is fairly small. We do use Guacamole for our remote access, both for our jump server as well as remote access into our environment. And we also use something called Nextcloud to provide access to the files in our environment. And that's done because we can enable two-factor authentication with Nextcloud and access all of the servers within our environment whilst turning on encryption and making sure that none of that data is ever exposed to the outside world. We've even gone to the point with Nextcloud, which we didn't really talk much about here, if you are looking at file sharing services, we've gotten to the point where we've actually enabled the access to Google Cloud and other drives through Nextcloud. Because what it does is it gives us the ability to ensure that only our corporate users can see and share the data that's stored in Google Drive. That's it for now. Take a look at my next series of videos, which will be around how to set up some of these remote access solutions.